Hey there folks, the number one whatever the weather fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Whatever the Weather record, Whatever the Weather 2, the sequel. Producer and composer Loraine James has spent the last several years marking herself as one of the premier young electronic music producers coming out of the United Kingdom right now. Her unique soundscapes and generally distinctive progressive take on the entire IDM genre, if I'm being completely honest, have quickly caused some of her records, like 2021's Reflections and the highly praised Gentle Confrontation in 2023, to become sort of modern cult classics in the current era of general electronic music. Certainly some of the most critically acclaimed solo electronic works that have come out of the UK in recent years. And when she introduced the world to her pseudonym Whatever the Weather in 2022, it was clear that she was using this new name to go in a stylistically different direction and to go down a different creative path that would allow her to explore new opportunities within the electronic world without really taking away any of the ideas that made her such a successful artist when releasing music under her own name. Where the albums released under her own name were sonically diverse and more often than not had the occasionally outright lush moments, Whatever the Weather's 2022 self-titled debut was never afraid to embrace the ambient influences with subtly psychedelic and glitchy undertones sprinkled throughout. And now here we are with its sequel album, Whatever the Weather 2, which follows the same formula and feels intentionally distanced from her usual work once again, but at the same time, it honestly manages to expand upon and improve upon the ideas presented in James's first initial outing under the Whatever the Weather name, making this easily the superior record in my eyes, despite the debut also being very good. The first Whatever the Weather album was obviously intended to be a cold listening experience, so to speak. I mean, how the listener interprets those tones emotionally just really depends on one's personal emotional understanding of those sounds. It's really just a case-by-case basis on how you take those ideas and interpret them on a personal level, but the Arctic setting was pretty undeniable, with the album cover being exactly that, the chilled sound of the overall record. It made for an overarching theme that was hard to not see, really. And now here we are with Whatever the Weather 2, which kicks off with the brief 1 degree Celsius and seemingly continues that trend sonically, but it wouldn't be completely off base to assume that this sequel album would be a complete and total, continuation of its predecessor, but at the same time, it really isn't. In many regards, despite the fact that it does follow some of the same beats of bringing Loraine James's brand of ambient music to the table, while frequently reintroducing the IDM sounds that she is most often noted for, Whatever the Weather 2 seemingly embraces the warmth of this sound and this particular niche of electronic music a lot more than its predecessor ever did, making it arguably the more dynamic record overall. If the desert album cover didn't give it away in the same way that the aforementioned Arctic album cover of Whatever the Weather's first record gave that record away sonically, then surely the listener will find that Whatever the Weather 2 is a significantly more warm listening experience. I mean, the record may not differ greatly from a general sonic perspective when you compare it to the first Whatever the Weather album, but generally speaking, there are a plethora of very minor but still noticeable embellishments that make it feel like a much more soothing hug at sunset kind of vibe here compared to the first album, which is something that personally strikes more of an emotional chord with me, and at the end of the day makes it feel completely unique, not only in the context of comparing this to the previous Whatever the Weather record, but also really anything else in James's discography to date, including work released under her own name. There are plenty of moments here that signify this as a pretty singular album in her discography. Tracks like 5 degrees Celsius with the electronic chime noises, or 18 degrees Celsius with the light insect-like buzzing. Those are just some of the prime examples of how James introduces these small but still frequent and always noticeable, always impactful musical ideas that give Whatever the Weather 2 a fresh creative voice without ever sacrificing the key components that make up her signature sound at this point. I mean, the way in which Whatever the Weather 2 feels like it takes up a new season and in turn a new series of emotions is a really welcome change in pace, especially for someone like myself who could potentially find less to value in a record that simply tries to copy what a successful predecessor did. And even with the relative diversity of sound on display here, I mean, just listen to some of the tracks like 20 degrees Celsius and 11 degrees Celsius intermittent rain to get a taste of the most reliably IDM-oriented cuts on the record. But at the end of the day, James's latest effort just feels like a total distance from her regular solo work, and it never feels like a total retread of the debut that she put out under Whatever the Weather as well. It feels like a unique entry in her discography despite sharing some degree of creativity with her past work, and at the end of the day, I think it's one of her better releases so far. And, of course, the production here is pretty predictably stunning as well, which honestly is more of an expectation considering the sort of standards that Loraine James has set for herself over time, but it's definitely something that you go into a record from her expecting. The quality of production, something to feel spacious and moving and almost outright alive despite the minimalism. She's just a rightfully well-respected producer of electronic music at this point, and it comes as no shock that she's continuing to uphold that reputation with the latest Whatever the Weather record. The instrumentals here are unsurprisingly focused on atmosphere at their core, and they create these vast sonic landscapes for the listener to get absorbed in without even really realizing that everything feels like it's constantly shifting at a snail's pace. And in that sense, this record almost feels ever so slightly hypnotic. Whether that is intentional or unintentional is obviously up for debate, but in a way, a lot of Whatever the Weather 2 just ends up feeling like an album that you can just easily drown in, and while one would think that that would make for a one-note and disinteresting listen, the way that many tracks just sort of morph their atmospheres in different, slow, yet equally emotional directions often makes Whatever the Weather 2, again, really easy to get lost in, and the mixing is expectedly great as well, with many of the previously mentioned minor details being given just enough personality that they are highlighted perfectly without ever disrupting tracks or feeling like an obnoxious attempt to create a new vibe compared to this record's predecessor. They are incorporated as well as they possibly could be, and at the end of the day, it's once again testament to the quality of production, mixing, general behind-the-scenes work that James brings to her records every single time she puts out a new album, and the somewhat frequent appearance of human voices as well is given just enough distance and reverb to make the listener feel like a spectator over the lives of people that they never met, saying words that they will never understand. And I think that really does add a certain degree of emotional depth to this record, and as a whole, it just kind of adds another layer of melancholy and isolation, yet at the same time, emotional satisfaction. It's a bit hard to describe in the same way that many ambient records like this are, but Whatever the Weather 2, no matter what you have in terms of experience relating to ambient records, is surely an album that people expected to be sonically pleasing, just based on James's reputation, and it does deliver in that regard. I feel it's a bit redundant to continue talking about how great of a producer she is, because that is, once again, basically her reputation at this point, at least a core quality of that positive reputation, but it is still something worth noting. Nothing has changed here from her past records in terms of the sheer quality, consistency, and emotional weight that she is capable of and willing to constantly put into her music, whether she's going for a more traditional IDM sound or a record like Whatever the Weather 2, where she's going in a more ambient-oriented direction. Once again, Loraine James is a highly, very well-respected musician within the UK electronic scene at large, not even talking about the smaller IDM scene, just in general electronic music coming out of the United Kingdom at the moment, and it comes as no surprise in turn that her latest album is excellent. In fact, it's one of my favorite records that she's put out to date, which is saying something since she never really has put out a record that I would consider weak or even mediocre. She's been consistently good to great from the start, and this record definitely falls into the great category, but what does feel somewhat shocking, however, is how this record regularly manages to take the ideas from the first Whatever the Weather record and reinvent them without ever making them feel redundant compared to her other projects, compared to the debut, from this particular pseudonym. This is an album that feels both summery and melancholy in the kind of way that you can only really experience when you're deeply in your emotions during a sunset, that kind of atmosphere and vibe, this sort of serenity that's somewhere between joy and despair that is difficult to capture in music earnestly without forcing it or trying too hard. The sound of something that is wistful and hopeful at the same time. It ends up being a moving emotional experience, and that translates to this record beautifully. And the final result is what I would easily consider to be one of the best electronic albums of the year so far, as well as easily one of the best records of James's career so far. And while I do love the work being put out under her name as well, and I think that it has been nothing but excellent so far, I'm actually very excited to see where she goes next with this Whatever the Weather project, if she chooses to continue it in the future. If the day comes where we get a Whatever the Weather 3, or even beyond that, I'm really genuinely excited to see where she takes these ambient influences, because as it stands, she's already captured a wide array of deeply important and deeply difficult to capture emotions that are just very, very rarely earnestly and so movingly captured by electronic albums like this. And while this album isn't necessarily one that I think is something that many people will frequently revisit just because of the fact that it is a record that captures a certain mood, a certain tone, it's also one that I feel myself consistently impressed by every time that I go back to it. And it's one that I can see certainly revisiting when I'm in a certain state of mind. And as a whole, everything here is great. Compositions, production, creative direction. I'm just a very big fan of this one in particular. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.